Hi everyone, it's Sandy and today I'm filming my November wrap-up. I ended up reading 6 books this month, so let's go ahead and jump right in. The very first book that I finished in November is Song of the Crimson Flower by Julie C. Dow. This is a book that takes place in the world of Forest of a Thousand Lanterns. That book is an East Asian reimagining of the Evil Queen legend, and this book is completely different. This book follows Vietnamese characters, and even though it takes place in the same world as Forest of a Thousand Lanterns, you don't necessarily need to read that book or the sequel in order to be able to read this book. This is just a companion novel, so it is nice if you have read those first two books and then jump into this one, but you don't need to. So to go into the plot of the story, it follows our main character Lan, and she is the daughter to this wealthy nobleman, and she's engaged to the son of this other wealthy family, and the father in the household is actually a physician, and he has this apprentice named Bao, and Bao actually has had a crush on Lan for many years. One day they have this interaction and he expresses his feelings for her, and she just blatantly rejects him in a very cruel manner. As a result of this rejection, Bao ends up running away and he encounters this witch that curses him, and the only way for him to be set free is through love. That's all I'm going to say about the plot. I was really looking forward to reading this book because it's a Vietnamese fantasy and there aren't many of those. Unfortunately, I didn't enjoy this book as much as I hoped to. This book is just very predictable. It's obvious that Lan is the person that's going to be helping Bao break this curse. However, they end up working together with this mindset that Bao's mother is going to end up breaking it, and it just makes absolutely no sense at all for Bao to assume that his mother is the one to be breaking this curse. This book is definitely heavily focused on the romance, and I didn't like that as much. We go into the story knowing that Bao has had this crush on Lan for so many years. I'm not trying to make fun of Bao or anything, but his feelings for her at the very start of the book is very strong, and it just felt kind of childish, cringy, and also laughable at the same time. The author does kind of set up what led to Bao having feelings for her, but at the same time, I wish it was more fleshed out, especially considering it's heavily one-sided. So the romance overall was not my favorite and was the least enjoyable part of the story. So aside from the romance, I do really enjoy the political aspect of the story. This part incorporates characters that we know and love from Forest of a Thousand Lanterns and Kingdom of the Blazing Phoenix, and it was just so great being able to see them again and seeing these new characters interact with them. All of these characters are explained as to who they are and what their roles are, but obviously if you haven't read the first two books, you might not care about these characters as much and you might be a little bit confused. But like I mentioned earlier, you really don't have to read the first two books to know what's going on in this book. However, I do think it makes the reading experience more enjoyable if you have. For a fantasy book, this book is pretty short. It's like 270 pages, and I just wish certain things were more developed. Going back to the romance, I do feel like once Lan starts developing feelings for Bao, it just felt really rushed and sudden. While I do love the happily ever after, this ending kind of went a little overboard with the happily ever after. I just didn't like the turning point with Bao and Lan's relationship. I just felt like that wasn't quite necessary. So overall, I would give this a 3 out of 5 stars. The next book that I finished is Turn of the Key by Ruth Ware, and this has become a new favorite of mine. I was hesitant to go into this book because although I've heard good things about it, literally in October I read The Death of Mrs. Westaway and it was a huge disappointment for me. So I wasn't sure what I was going to think about this book, but I did want to give the author a second chance, and I'm really glad I did. This book follows our main character Rowan, who recently accepts this job offer as a nanny for this family in Scotland. The story starts off with her in prison, and the whole book is essentially her writing a letter to a lawyer detailing the experiences she had while babysitting for this family, and she's in prison because she has been wrongfully charged for a crime that she did not commit, and this crime involves the death of one of the children that she was nannying for. So definitely a huge trigger warning for the death of a child. This was honestly an unexpected surprise for me. This was an incredibly creepy and suspenseful thriller, and I loved every second of it. I do really enjoy stories that kind of start off with the main character pretty much saying this is where I'm at, and then it jumps back in time detailing this is how I ended up where I am today. I really love the atmosphere and the setting of the story. The family that Rowan is nannying for has this very tech-savvy home. It's essentially a smart home. The house is located in the Scottish Highlands. It's kind of isolated from everyone else. There's this foresty / woodsy area that's right next to it, and there's also this backstory to this house that I won't get into. We know that one of these kids that Rowan is nannying for ends up dying. So throughout the story, you're kind of picking up on things of how Rowan ended up where she is today. And the way the story is crafted and written is just brilliant. I loved it. The ending honestly was like, oh my god. The ending was kind of open-ended. You do get some answers, but at the same time, there are also other questions you want to know. Aside from the ending, I also really enjoyed some other revelations in the story. I wouldn't call Rowan an unreliable character, but at the same time, you can tell and you get the vibe that she's holding something something back. So I really enjoyed learning about Rowan's history and seeing how that kind of comes into play with everything. These moments where she's holding something back is pretty subtle and you kind of end up forgetting about it throughout the book, but then all of a sudden it comes to play at the end and you're like, oh my god. I was honestly really blown away. And I do admit that this is a slow story, and usually I'm not a fan of slow stories. I think the death of Mrs. Westaway was incredibly slow and I didn't like it, but I enjoyed the pacing of this. I think the pacing of this book really fits the story. This is a book that I would highly recommend, and I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. The third book that I finished in November is one of my most anticipated releases of the year, and that is Supernova by Marissa Meyer. This is the third and final book in the Renegades trilogy. I was really looking forward to this book and I wasn't disappointed. I do have to say that this is probably my least favorite in the trilogy, but I really loved reading about these characters. I'm just so invested in these characters, and I was invested in finding out what happens to them and the world that they live in. This book was just very intense, and if you haven't read Renegades, I would highly recommend it. It's one of my favorite trilogies. It's basically a book that takes place in a world where there are superheroes called renegades and villains called anarchists, and it follows two main characters. We have Nova and Adrian. Nova is an anarchist, and when she was young, she witnesses her entire family being killed, and during this time, she had hoped that the renegades would come and save her and her family, but they never showed up. So throughout her life, she has held this hatred and this grudge for the renegades for what happened to her family. And the second main character that this story follows is Adrian. He is the son to two renegades council members. One day, Nova ends up posing as a renegade, and she enters the renegades headquarters with the intention of bringing them down. And this is where Adrian and Nova end up working together on the same team, except Adrian and all the other renegades don't know that Nova is actually an anarchist and she has bad intentions. What I really loved about the Renegades trilogy is the whole secret identities aspect and characters with powers. I essentially enjoy reading most books that have characters with powers in it. So Nova has a secret identity of being an anarchist, but Adrian also has his own secret identity that I won't get into. But seeing these characters hide this identity from each other and other characters, I loved seeing that play out. It just really created a lot of tension in moments where they're really close to being found out. But if you have read these books, then you know that there is a point where these secret identities are revealed, and I was so nervous about what was going to happen when Nova is found out as being an anarchist. I was honestly pretty terrified, and there's also a lot of scenes in this book that really had me at the edge of my seat. There are also certain parts of the book where I felt like things were resolved a little bit too easily. I didn't mind it as much, but that is something I wanted to point out. And also, that epilogue. I never would have predicted that in a million years. I really love that epilogue, and it kind of makes me hopeful of a potential spin-off series because I would totally be down for that. But overall, I would give this a 4 out of 5 stars. I did really enjoy it, but like I said earlier, it's not my favorite in the trilogy. The next book that I finished is The Toll by Neal Shusterman. This is the third and final book in Arcs of a Scythe trilogy. The first book is called Scythe, and it basically takes place in a world where death has been conquered. There's no way for you to die by hunger or disease or whatever. The only way where you can essentially die is by fire, where your body is completely burned to the point where nothing can be salvageable, or if you get gleaned by a scythe. If you're a scythe, you're essentially given the authority to kill people in order to help control the population. So the first book follows our two main characters, Rowan and Citra, as they are apprenticed to a scythe. Unfortunately, I was pretty disappointed with this book. As with each book in the trilogy, the world expands and we're introduced to new characters and new point of views, and frankly, I just did not care about some of these new characters. The multiple point of views just resulted in the story being over 600 pages, and I just felt like it was very long, and it made certain parts of the story felt very slow and dragged on, and the whole story just kind of felt like a middle book where it's building up to something big. Things were happening, but I just didn't feel engaged and I couldn't really get into the story. Also, the two main characters that we grew to know and love in Scythe were essentially separated from each other for the rest of the trilogy, and I hate that. I hate when two main characters are separating each other for a majority of the book, and it's not a majority of this book, it's a majority of Thunderhead as well, and that aspect just really annoyed me because I was hoping that we'd get to see more of Rowan and Citra interact with each other and be in each other's presence, but they were just separated from each other for the whole entire trilogy after Scythe, and it was just very disappointing to not see them be together. I enjoy the commentary on current society, past historical events, the religious parallels, and also the discussions on technology that is definitely woven throughout the entire trilogy. However, the ending was just unsatisfying. Like I mentioned earlier, the whole story is essentially one buildup of all these little subplots that play a role at the very end, and then the ending happens and that's that. I'm just like, what? That's it? And there's one thing in particular about the ending that I really didn't like, and that has to do with the relationship between two side characters, I would say. I'm not going to say who these characters are because I feel like that would be a spoiler, but these two characters' relationship was essentially built on lies and betrayal, and I was just surprised that the author kind of kept pushing this relationship to the readers, and seeing that play out at the end was just like, why. It just left a bad taste in my mouth, and overall the ending was just meh. So yeah, this is a pretty unpopular opinion on the Toll, and I do have a reading vlog for this, so if you're interested in checking that out, I will leave it linked below. So overall, I would give this a 2.5 out of 5 stars. The next book that I finished is On the Come Up by Angie Thomas. This book came out earlier in 2019, and I'm so happy that I finally got to it. I do want to give trigger warnings for racism, racial profiling, gangs, drug dealing, mentions of drug addiction. This book follows a 16-year-old main character named Bree, and she is an aspiring rapper. One day she creates this rap and she puts it on the internet and it goes viral, and there is a lot of controversy regarding the rap that she created. I really enjoyed the different themes that the story touches on. Bree grew up poor, she's raised by a single parent who is in recovery from a drug addiction, and you really see how her financial situation impacts the decision that she makes. But I really love the way Angie Thomas portrayed her family dynamics. Her mom has definitely gone through a lot, but I admire her character so much. Despite losing her husband due to gang violence, being in recovery, being a single mom to 2 kids, losing a job, and just trying to make ends meet, I really loved her character so much and all the talks that she would have with Bree. Even though Bree's brother didn't have a huge presence in the story, I really admire his dedication to his family and his ambitions as well. Even though I wasn't a huge fan of the grandma, she definitely grew on me by the end. And then I also really loved her friendships with Sunny and Malik. Sunny is gay, and I really enjoyed his storyline in the book. Also, I would really love to actually be able to listen to Bree's raps. I think that would be super cool. Overall, I gave this book a 4 out of 5 stars. There wasn't really anything I disliked about the story, but I just didn't love it enough to give it a full 5 out of 5 stars. And the last book that I finished in November was a book that I finished on the very last day, and that is Twice in a Blue Moon by Christina. The story starts off with this main character named Tate who travels to London with her grandmother, where she meets this boy named Sam who is traveling with his grandfather. During this London trip, both Sam and Tate develop this really close connection and relationship. However, something happens and things don't end well between them. So now in the present day, which takes place 14 years later, Tate is an actress and she is starring as the lead in this new film. She gets to set and she sees none other than Sam for the first time in 14 years, and the story goes from there. I literally finished this book last night, so I'm still processing some of my thoughts. This was an easy read. I read through it really quickly. However, I wasn't a huge fan of the love interest Sam. I feel like his character really wasn't fleshed out and that there was no substance to his character at all. The authors build up his history with his grandparents, but other than that, I felt like I barely knew him, and I just really didn't understand this connection that Sam and Tate had. The relationship back in London did progress super quickly. Since it was pretty insta-lovey, I just didn't feel this connection between Sam and Tate. So now when we're in the present time and it's 14 years later, I just didn't feel this connection between them at all. Sam was a very flat character and I wasn't that invested in Tate either. I did really like the side characters in the story. Honestly, I felt more of a connection between Tate and her co-star than I did with Tate and Sam. Even though the relationship between Tate and her co-star was pretty much only platonic, I just felt like it was more interesting to read about them than to read about Tate and Sam. Overall, this book was alright. I didn't hate it, but I also didn't love it, so I ended up rating this a 3 stars. So those are all the books that I finished in November. If you've read any of those books, please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time. Bye!